The last thing Diane Calloway said to her best friend before she was taken to the airport was, "I trust you with everything I have." She was weak. She had lost nearly 20 pounds in 4 months. Her skin had a pallor that frightened everyone who loved her, and her voice, once loud enough to fill a room, had shrunk to something quiet and careful, like a candle burning low. She reached out and held Rachel's hand at the door, and Rachel held it back, and they looked at each other the way women who have been friends for 20 years look at each other. With history. With tenderness. With the kind of trust that takes a lifetime to build. Diane did not know, in that moment, that she was saying goodbye to the person who had been slowly destroying her. She did not know that the hand she was holding had been the source of everything she was suffering. She only knew that she was sick, that she was scared, and that her best friend was standing there promising to take care of everything while she was gone. Rachel smiled. She said, "Come back to us soon." And Diane believed her. Marcus Calloway had spent 15 years building something real. He had started in his late 20s with a single distribution contract, hauling wholesale goods across 2 states in a truck he could barely afford to maintain. By the time he was in his early 40s, that single contract had become a network of businesses that employed over 60 people and generated more money in a month than most families saw in a year. He was not the kind of man who wore his wealth on his sleeve. He drove modestly. He dressed plainly. He gave generously to his church and his community, and he never once forgot where he had come from. The people who knew Marcus Calloway described him the same way, always, hardworking, quiet, loyal. The kind of man who built things slowly and protected them carefully. And the thing he was most careful about protecting was his family. Years before any of this began, Marcus had sat down with his attorney and his mother, Eleanor, and made a decision that was as much about wisdom as it was about love. He had placed the majority of the family's assets, the properties, the business holdings, the investments, into a trust managed under Eleanor's name. It was a protective measure, the kind that wealthy families use to shield their estates from legal exposure and outside interference. Eleanor Calloway was a woman of iron integrity, and Marcus trusted her completely. She was 70 years old, sharp as she had ever been, and she had raised her son to understand that real wealth is not just money, it is the structures you build around money to make sure it serves the people you love long after you are gone. That decision, made quietly in an attorney's office years before trouble came, would end up being the most important thing Marcus Calloway ever did. Rachel Summers had been part of the Calloway world for as long as anyone could remember. She and Diane had met in college, 2 young women from modest backgrounds who recognized in each other a particular kind of ambition, the kind that comes not from greed but from having grown up without enough. They had been inseparable through their 20s. When Diane met Marcus and fell in love, Rachel was the first person she called. When they got engaged, Rachel was asked to be the maid of honor. She stood at that altar in a pale blue dress and cried happy tears while her best friend became a Calloway. She came to every holiday dinner. She knew every room in that house. She knew Eleanor's favorite tea and Marcus's preferred way of taking his coffee and the small rituals that make a family a family. She was woven so completely into their lives that no one, not Marcus, not Eleanor, not Diane herself, ever thought to question her presence. She was simply part of them. Which is exactly what she had always intended. If you are new to this channel, my name is your narrator, and this is Hidden Intent Stories, where we bring you the most powerful true-to-life emotional dramas every single week. Please take a moment right now to subscribe and turn on your notifications. You are not going to want to miss what comes next. Diane's illness did not arrive like a storm. It arrived the way the most dangerous things always arrive, slowly, quietly, disguised as something ordinary. It started with fatigue. The kind of tiredness that a busy woman might easily explain away, too much work, not enough sleep, the relentless pace of managing a household and a social life and a marriage all at once. Then came the nausea. Then the weight loss. Then the days when Diane could not get out of bed before noon, when her body felt like it was fighting something invisible and losing. Marcus took her to their family doctor first. Then to a specialist. Then to another specialist. The tests came back with results that were ambiguous, contradictory, frustratingly inconclusive. One physician used the word idiopathic, which is a medical term that essentially means we do not know. Another suggested it might be an autoimmune response. A third mentioned, briefly and then quickly retracted, the possibility of toxic exposure. No one followed that thread. No one thought to pull it. During those months, Rachel was everywhere. She came to the house 3 or 4 times a week. She brought food, home-cooked meals, soups and casseroles and the kinds of things you bring to someone who is too sick to cook for themselves. She drove Diane to appointments when Marcus had to be at work. She sat with her in waiting rooms and held her hand during consultations and took notes on what the doctors said so that Diane would not have to try to remember everything through the fog of her exhaustion. She was the picture of devotion. Nurses at the clinic knew her by name. Marcus thanked her constantly, told her he did not know what they would do without her. Eleanor, who had come to stay with them for a while, watched all of this carefully and said very little. She was grateful for Rachel's presence in the practical sense. But there was something she could not name, a low and persistent unease, like a sound you hear just below the threshold of hearing. She pushed it aside. She told herself she was a suspicious old woman looking for problems where there were none. She told herself Rachel was simply a good friend doing what good friends do. She was almost able to believe it. After 14 months, the decision was made to take Diane abroad. The local specialists had exhausted their options. A physician at a hospital overseas had reviewed Diane's case remotely and believed he had identified a possible diagnosis that had been missed, a rare and aggressive condition that required immediate specialist intervention. Marcus did not hesitate. He liquidated what he needed to, arranged the travel, and within a week they were on a plane. Rachel came to the airport to say goodbye. She held Diane's hand at the departure gate. She told her she loved her. She told her to fight. She watched the plane until it disappeared. And then she drove home, alone, and she waited. The call came 11 weeks later. It came to Marcus first, in the middle of the night, from the hospital overseas. The medical team had done everything they could. Diane's condition had deteriorated faster than anyone had anticipated. She had gone into cardiac arrest during a procedure, and despite their efforts, she had not recovered. She was gone. Marcus sat in the hospital room where he had been keeping vigil for weeks and he did not move for a very long time. He called his mother. He called Rachel. He said the words out loud and they did not feel real. Diane Calloway was 39 years old. She had been his wife for 11 years. She was the first person he had ever loved completely, and now she was in a foreign hospital, and there was nothing left to do. The question of bringing Diane home was complicated by distance and cost and the sheer weight of Marcus's grief. Eleanor was too old and too unwell to travel internationally. Marcus was barely functional. The hospital's administrative team handled the initial documentation. The process of repatriating a body from overseas is lengthy and expensive, and in the fog of his loss, Marcus could not organize it. He flew home alone. He told himself he would make arrangements when he was stronger. He told himself he would bring her home when he could think clearly. But grief does not clear on a schedule, and the weeks became months, and Diane remained abroad, and eventually the idea of bringing her home became one of those painful things that people carry without acting on, buried under the weight of everything else. Rachel was at the house when Marcus arrived home. She had prepared it for him, cleaned, stocked the kitchen, placed flowers on the table the way Diane used to. She had thought of everything. She held him while he wept and said nothing, because she understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can offer someone is silence. She came back the next day. And the day after that. She was always there, always steady, always exactly what Marcus needed in that particular moment. People who witnessed it said she was an extraordinary friend. They said Diane would have been grateful. Eleanor watched, and said nothing, and felt that low unease growing louder. If this story is hitting close to home, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do that now. We tell stories like this every week because we believe the truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way to the surface. It took 2 years. 2 years of grief and proximity and the slow, careful architecture of Rachel's patience. She never pushed. She never rushed. She let Marcus come to her at his own pace, let him believe that what was developing between them was organic, unplanned, something that had emerged from shared loss rather than deliberate strategy. By the time Marcus told Eleanor that he and Rachel had grown close, Eleanor had already known for months. She had seen it coming the way you see weather coming when you have lived long enough to read the sky. She sat with her son in her kitchen and she listened to him talk about Rachel, about her steadiness, her warmth, her familiarity, and she chose her words with the precision of a woman who understood that what she said in this moment would determine everything that came after. She did not tell him what she suspected. She was not ready. She had no proof, only instinct and observation, and she knew that a mother's instinct, no matter how accurate, is not enough to break a grown man's heart without evidence. So she said she was glad he had found comfort. She said she hoped he would be careful. She said she trusted him to make the right decision. And then she went home and she prayed, and she thought, and she began, quietly and without telling anyone, to make preparations. Marcus and Rachel married in a small ceremony 18 months later. She became Rachel Calloway. She moved into the house. She took down some of Diane's photographs, not all of them, just enough to make the house feel like hers without making it obvious what she was doing. She learned the household accounts, the business contacts, the names of Marcus's attorneys and advisors. She was building knowledge the way a general builds a map before a campaign, methodically, patiently, piece by piece. She already knew where the wealth was. She had known for years. It was in Eleanor's name. And Eleanor was old. And Eleanor was getting sicker. Rachel simply needed time. Marcus collapsed 14 months into the marriage. He had been complaining of fatigue for weeks, dismissing it, the way men of his generation tend to dismiss the signals their bodies send them. Then came the nausea, the weight loss, the same creeping deterioration that had taken Diane. His doctors were alarmed by how quickly it progressed. The pattern was almost identical to Diane's illness, and one physician, a younger doctor who had reviewed both cases, raised a concern in a private note that was filed but never formally acted upon. He wrote the word intentional with a question mark and then crossed it out. He did not know what to do with the thought, and so he did nothing with it. Marcus was flown abroad for treatment, to the same network of hospitals that had treated Diane. Rachel arranged everything. She was efficient, organized, heartbroken in all the visible ways. She flew with him to get him settled, met with his medical team, signed the necessary authorizations, and then flew home. She called every few days. She gave updates to Eleanor, to friends, to the small circle of people who knew what was happening. She was the face of a devoted wife managing an unbearable situation with grace and strength. And when the call came, 3 months later, in the early hours of a cold morning, that Marcus Calloway had not survived, that he had died of complications from his condition in a hospital overseas, Rachel Calloway received that news alone. She sat in the kitchen of the house that had been Diane's house, in the chair where Diane used to sit, and she let herself feel whatever it was she felt. Then she composed herself. And she turned her attention to Eleanor. Eleanor Calloway received the news about her son the way a woman receives news she has been dreading but somehow already knew was coming. She wept. She prayed. She sat very still for a long time in her living room and she thought about Marcus as a boy, the way he used to fall asleep in the car on long drives, the way he laughed too loudly at his own jokes, the way he had looked at Diane on their wedding day like she was the answer to a question he had been asking his whole life. She grieved all of that. She grieved it completely and without reservation. And then, when the grief had moved through her the way grief eventually does, she picked up the telephone and she called her attorney. She did not tell Rachel about that call. She did not tell anyone. She met with the attorney twice over the following weeks, and both times she arranged the meetings for hours when Rachel was out of the house. She was methodical about it. She understood that she was old and unwell, that her body was failing her in ways she could no longer pretend were temporary. She understood that she did not have very much time. And she understood, with the deep and unshakable clarity that sometimes comes to people at the end of their lives, exactly what she needed to do. Rachel had moved into Eleanor's home under the banner of caregiving. She managed the medications, the meals, the appointments, the daily logistics of caring for a woman whose body was slowly giving out. She was present and attentive and relentlessly pleasant. Eleanor thanked her for everything. She accepted every meal, every pill, every ride to the doctor with quiet gratitude. She gave Rachel no reason to suspect anything was wrong. She performed the role of a grateful old woman being cared for by a devoted daughter-in-law, and she performed it perfectly. Because Eleanor Calloway had not survived 73 years of life without learning how to keep a secret. There is something you need to understand about Eleanor's will before we go further, because it is not simply a document about money. It is the final statement of a woman who had watched her family be taken apart piece by piece and had spent the last years of her life deciding how to respond. She had two objectives. The first was to ensure that Rachel Calloway received nothing, not a property, not an account, not a single asset that the Calloway family had ever built. The second was something more personal, something that went beyond legal strategy into the territory of a mother's love. Eleanor could not travel. Her body would not allow it. But she had never stopped thinking about the fact that her son and her daughter-in-law were still overseas, in hospital records, in administrative files, in a foreign country, and no one had ever brought them home. She could not do it herself. She had tried to understand the process and had found it overwhelming, the documentation, the international coordination, the expense. But she could instruct others to do it. She could put the resources in place and make the retrieval of Marcus and Diane part of her final wishes. She could ensure that even after she was gone, someone with the authority and the funding to act would pick up what she had been unable to finish. She wrote that provision into the will with the same quiet determination she had brought to everything in her life. The church she had attended for 40 years, Calvary Baptist, a congregation she trusted completely, would receive the entirety of the Calloway estate. And they were instructed, as a condition of that inheritance, to use a portion of those resources to locate and repatriate the remains of Marcus Calloway and his wife Diane, so that they could finally be brought home and laid to rest with dignity. Eleanor died on a Tuesday in early spring. She went quietly. Rachel was in the next room. The funeral was handled, the condolences received, the arrangements made. 3 days later, the will reading was scheduled at the attorney's office downtown. Rachel arrived at that office believing she had won. She had spent years on this. She had been patient in ways that most people are not capable of sustaining. She had cooked and cleaned and administered medications and sat through long nights and performed every act of care that the situation required, all of it calculated, all of it in service of this single moment. She was the last Calloway. There was no one else. The wealth had to come to her. It was the only logical conclusion to everything she had set in motion. She sat down at that conference table and she folded her hands and she waited for the attorney to confirm what she already knew. The attorney opened the file and began to read. Eleanor Calloway, of sound mind and full legal capacity, hereby bequeaths the entirety of her estate, all properties, all holdings, all assets held in her name under the Calloway Family Trust, to Calvary Baptist Church, to be administered by the Church Board for Community Outreach and Education Initiatives. The estate is to be named the Diane and Marcus Calloway Memorial Fund, in honor and loving memory of her daughter-in-law and her son. Rachel did not move. Furthermore, the church is hereby instructed, as a binding condition of this bequest, to allocate no less than a designated portion of the estate toward the location, documentation, and repatriation of the remains of Marcus James Calloway and Diane Marie Calloway, currently believed to be held in administrative records at medical facilities overseas. It is the final wish of Eleanor Calloway that her son and his wife be brought home. The room was very quiet. Rachel sat with her hands still folded on the table and she stared at a point somewhere beyond the attorney's shoulder and she did not speak. The numbers that had lived in her head for years, the properties, the accounts, the value of everything she had worked toward, began, one by one, to dissolve. The attorney continued reading the secondary provisions. Rachel heard none of them. She was somewhere else entirely, trying to understand how an old woman dying in a back bedroom had managed to take everything from her without saying a single word. The church board moved quickly. They took their responsibilities seriously, and Eleanor Calloway had been a beloved member of that congregation for over 4 decades. Within weeks of the will being probated, the board had retained an international affairs coordinator and begun the process of locating the relevant hospital records overseas. It was painstaking work, bureaucratic, multilingual, slow. But they were thorough. And what they found, when they finally reached the right departments and pulled the right files, was not what anyone had expected. The records for Diane Marie Calloway showed that she had been admitted in critical condition, had suffered cardiac arrest, and had been declared clinically dead. That part matched what everyone knew. But the records also showed something else, a notation made 6 weeks after that declaration, added by a different physician, a specialist who had been brought in for a second review of unresponsive patients. The notation said, "Patient showing signs of neurological activity inconsistent with brain death. Reclassification pending." And then, further down, in a different hand, "Patient transferred to long-term care unit. Status revised to coma, indeterminate prognosis." Diane Calloway had not died. She had been in a coma. The initial declaration had been made under extreme circumstances, by a medical team that had done what they believed to be correct in the moment, and the revision had been made too late to reach the family before the news had already traveled home and been accepted as final. By the time anyone thought to send updated information, it had fallen into the gap that exists in international medical administration, the gap where paperwork goes when no one is actively watching for it. The records for Marcus James Calloway told a version of the same story. Declared dead following organ failure. Notation revised 12 weeks later by a supervising physician. Patient unresponsive but displaying autonomic function. Transferred to neurological care unit. Status, coma, monitoring ongoing. They were both alive. They had been alive the entire time. It took 4 more months to navigate the international process, the legal documentation, the medical authorizations, the coordination between the church's representatives and the overseas hospital administration. During that time Rachel Calloway was informed that the estate had been transferred to the church and that she had no further claim on any Calloway assets. She contested it. She hired an attorney and made arguments and filed papers. None of it went anywhere. Eleanor's will was airtight. The attorney she had used had made certain of it. When Diane Calloway opened her eyes fully for the first time in years, the first face she saw was a nurse she did not know, in a room she did not recognize, in a country far from home. The recovery was not immediate. It was slow and painful and frightening. There were weeks of rehabilitation, of relearning, of piecing together what had happened in the time she had lost. The hospital staff helped her understand. Church representatives came and sat with her and told her about Eleanor's will, about what Eleanor had done, about how she had come to be found. Diane listened to all of it. She was quiet for a long time after. Then she asked about Marcus. Marcus was in a facility 3 hours away. His recovery had progressed further than Diane's. He had been conscious and functional for several months by the time she woke, but had been waiting, working with the church's coordinators, piecing together the shape of what had happened back home. When they brought Diane to him, he stood up from his chair and he crossed the room and he held her, and neither of them said anything for a long time, because there are moments in a human life that exist beyond the reach of language. They came home together on a flight that landed on a gray afternoon in late autumn. There was no announcement. There was no press. There was only a car that drove them from the airport to the attorney's office, where a meeting had been quietly arranged, and where Rachel Calloway was present, having been told only that there was a matter regarding the estate that required her attendance. Rachel walked into that room expecting a legal formality. She sat down. She looked at the door when it opened. And the world she had built, every carefully laid stone of it, every year of patience and calculation and performance, came apart in the space of a single breath. Diane walked in first. Then Marcus. They were thinner than Rachel remembered, and there was something in their eyes that had not been there before, a quality that comes to people who have survived something that should have killed them, a stillness that sits beneath the surface of everything they do. Diane looked at Rachel the way you look at someone you once loved, from a very great distance. She did not look angry. She looked like a woman who had already done the work of understanding what had happened to her, and had arrived at a place beyond rage, in the territory of something quieter and more permanent. Marcus sat down. He looked at Rachel for a moment without speaking. Then he turned to the attorney and said, "Please proceed." The next several hours covered what needed to be covered. The estate. The church. The investigation that law enforcement had already been briefed on, quietly, by the church board's legal team, who had become concerned during the repatriation process when the pattern of events began to form a picture too consistent to be coincidence. The attending physician overseas who had initially flagged toxic exposure as a possibility in Diane's case and had never been properly followed up. The insurance documentation. The timeline. Rachel Calloway did not speak for most of it. She sat with her hands in her lap and she looked at the table and she understood, with absolute clarity, that there was no version of this room that she walked out of the same way she walked in. Everything she had taken was being accounted for. Everything she had done was being named. The friendship she had betrayed, the families she had dismantled, the years she had stolen, it was all there in that room, laid out without theater or drama, simply present. Simply true. Diane spoke once, near the end. She said, "I told you I trusted you with everything I had." She paused. She said, "I want you to know that I meant it." She did not say anything else. She did not need to. There is a particular cruelty in being betrayed by someone you chose. Not the betrayal of a stranger or an enemy, those, at least, you can make sense of. But the betrayal of a best friend, of someone you loved freely and completely, someone you invited into the most private spaces of your life, that kind of wound does not close the way ordinary wounds do. Diane Calloway would carry the shape of it for years. But she would also carry something else, something that Rachel had not intended to give her, the knowledge that even at her most vulnerable, even when someone was working against her with patience and precision and deliberate cruelty, she had been loved. By Marcus. By Eleanor. By a church full of people who had taken an old woman's dying wish seriously enough to follow it across an ocean. Eleanor Calloway never knew her son and daughter-in-law were alive. She died believing she had lost them. But she had loved them with everything she had, and she had protected what was theirs with everything she had left, and in doing so she had set in motion the sequence of events that brought them home. There is something in that worth sitting with. A woman who could not travel, who could not fight, who could not even speak openly about what she suspected, who did the only thing she could do, quietly, in an attorney's office, and trusted that it would be enough. It was enough. It was more than enough. Rachel Calloway faced a legal process that took years to resolve. The investigation uncovered what it uncovered, and the courts determined what they determined. That part of the story belongs to the legal record. What belongs here, what matters for the purposes of understanding what this story is really about, is simpler than any legal outcome. Rachel Summers had spent years trying to take a life that was never hers. She had taken a friendship, a marriage, a family's peace, two people's health, and years of time that cannot be given back. And in the end, she had nothing. Not a property. Not an account. Not a name. Not a friend. Nothing. Because the one thing she had never calculated for, the one variable she had not accounted for in all her years of patient strategy, was an old woman with a clear conscience and a good attorney and a love for her family that turned out to be stronger than everything Rachel had built against it. Diane Calloway had trusted her best friend with everything she had. Rachel had taken it. But Eleanor Calloway had made sure it could not be kept. And the truth, slow, methodical, unstoppable, had done the rest. If this story moved you, please subscribe to Hidden Intent Stories and share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Every week we bring you the most powerful emotional dramas, stories about betrayal, sacrifice, and the justice that finds its way home no matter how long it takes. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. And remember, no matter how long someone has been running from the truth, they cannot run forever. We will see you next time.